Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise and get right to the heart of things. And today, we're taking on a really big topic, one that's both profound and, let's be honest, often pretty confusing. Spirituality. We want to look at its hidden language, specifically why understanding the implied meaning in spiritual ideas and texts is just so crucial. Our mission, really, is to give you, our listener, a bit of a shortcut to get past those common roadblocks that make spiritual wisdom sometimes feel, well, locked away. We're aiming to help decode the deeper truths, and we're basing this whole deep dive on a fascinating paper that really breaks down these exact challenges. So get ready for maybe a shift in perspective.
Absolutely. Think of it as moving beyond just the surface level. Because spiritual wisdom, it often operates on a different wavelength than our everyday chat, doesn't it? It's like trying to judge a painting just by looking at its frame. We're going to uncover some, I think, surprising things and hopefully trigger a few of those aha moments for you. It might just reframe how you approach spirituality.
Okay, let's dive in then, because even before you get to the really big concepts, the language itself, wow, that can be a hurdle. One of the first things people run into is just basic confusion about terminology. It feels like people are using the same words, but maybe meaning totally different things.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's a real challenge. And what's interesting is how these core spiritual words can carry, quite different shades of meaning depending on which text or tradition you're looking at. Take Antakarana, for instance.
Yeah.
It's often translated as the inner instrument or maybe the mind complex.
Okay.
But some traditions, like Jagadguru Sri Shankaracharya's, say it has 4 parts: mind, subconscious mind, intellect, and ego.
4 parts. Got it.
But then, other schools of thought, they'll say, no, it's just 3: mind, intellect, and ego.
So same term, different components.
Exactly. And that's a pretty significant difference when you're talking about the fundamental inner workings, even though they're pointing to the same basic faculty.
So, right there, how does a seeker, someone trying to learn, navigate that? If the definitions aren't even consistent, doesn't that just add more confusion?
It absolutely can. And that's precisely the issue the source material highlights. It gets even trickier with a word like soul or atma.
Right, atma.
In some contexts, it points to Brahman, the ultimate all-pervading God principle, the big one.
The big S, maybe.
Kind of. But then in other places, it means the embodied soul, the one actually doing spiritual practice, the jivatma.
Okay, the individual soul.
Or sometimes it might even just refer to the vital energy layer or the mental body sheath. So one word, multiple potential meanings. Without good guidance, figuring out the real intent is, well, it's tough.
Okay, terminology's tricky, check. But you said things get really interesting. Where does that happen? You mentioned something about math, like what 1 + 1 not always being 2. That sounds like where we hit the core issue. The difference between literal and implied meaning.
This is it. This is absolutely central. Because spirituality is fundamentally trying to express the inexpressible. Things that are at their core, beyond ordinary words, beyond the intellect.
Wow.
So inevitably, there's this gap, right, between the literal words on the page and the deeper spiritual truths they're gesturing towards.
That gap. Okay.
And unlike, say, a simple math equation, in spirituality, the meaning can shift dramatically. That 1 + 1 example is perfect. Literally, 1 guru + 1 disciple, 1 guru. Makes no sense mathematically.
None at all.
But the implied meaning is incredibly profound. It symbolizes the disciple through their practice and devotion, merging completely into the guru, becoming one with the guru's wisdom, their essence, their individual identity dissolves.
Whoa. Okay, that's a different kind of math entirely. That really changes things.
It does, and our source has some fantastic examples of this in action.
Lay them on us. Let's start with God's omnipresence. The idea that the Lord exists everywhere. Sounds simple enough, right?
On the surface, yes. But if you take it absolutely literally, the source points out, you could end up doing some pretty absurd things.
Like what?
Like feeling you need to pay formal respects, do obeisance to a toilet basin because, well, God is everywhere.
Okay, point taken. That's absurd. So what's the real meaning, the implied one?
The implied meaning is much deeper. It's that to truly experience that universal presence, you first have to forget your own individual self, your ego. Let go of that I, It's not about God being physically in every single object, but about realizing the divine principle pervades everything, and it's your ego that stops you from seeing it. Without that understanding, it just leads to confusion or, frankly, silly practices.
That makes so much more sense. It's about perception, not just location. What about other teachings, like equality towards all? The Bhagavad Gita says the truly enlightened person sees a scholar, a priest, someone from a low caste, a cow, an elephant, even a dog, all with an equal eye. But again, if you take that literally, based on their physical forms, you'd end up in bizarre situations. The source mentions marrying your daughter to a dog or claiming a donkey as your father.
Exactly. The absurdity highlights the mistake. The implied meaning isn't about equality in their physical bodies or social roles. It's about seeing the God principle, the divine consciousness, that exists equally within all of them.
Ah, the inner spark.
Precisely. The enlightened person sees past the outer differences to that shared spiritual essence. The forms vary, but the divinity within is the same.
Okay, that distinction is key. What about actions by a guru? Sometimes you read about things that sound quite intense, like the literal idea of shaving off a disciple's head or even flogging a disciple. How does someone new to this not just see that as, well, harsh physical discipline?
It's a really good question. And it highlights why having a proper guru or deep spiritual insight is often considered so important, because the implied meaning is completely different. It actually signifies the guru destroying the impressions, the sanskars, from the disciples' past births held in their mind. These are subtle karmic patterns.
So it's symbolic.
Entirely. The physical action described is an allegory for a deep spiritual cleansing. It's about breaking old, unhelpful patterns and attachments, not about inflicting physical pain.
That context changes everything. There's another story in the source, right? About Samarth Ramdaswamy and Manik Prabhu.
Yes, a fascinating one. Samarth Ramdaswamy apparently asked Manik Prabhu, "Why are you keeping those women of low morality, Randa, with you?" And Manik Prabhu immediately sent them away.
Okay, on the surface, that sounds like a pretty harsh judgment about the company Manik Prabhu was keeping.
It does sound that way, doesn't it? But the spiritual translation is completely different. In that context, Randa wasn't referring to actual women at all.
No. What did it mean then?
It was a coded term for Rudy City supernatural powers.
Ah, so the guru was actually advising him.
To let go of his attachment to these psychic or supernatural abilities, they can be a major distraction on the spiritual path. He wasn't criticizing Manik Prabhu's friends, he was guiding him away from spiritual obstacles. Without knowing that implied meaning, you'd completely misunderstand the exchange as just moral policing.
Incredible. The layers are just wow. And then there's that verse from the Ramacharitamanas. This one sounds really jarring if you take it literally.
Yes, this one often causes significant misunderstanding if the context is missed.
The literal translation is given as a drum, a fool, a person of a low caste to Karis, an animal, and a woman are all responsible for bringing about one's downfall. I mean, taken literally, that sounds incredibly offensive, particularly towards women and certain social groups.
Extremely offensive and completely wrong if taken literally. This is probably one of the most crucial examples of needing the implied meaning. The text isn't making derogatory statements about these literal things or people. It's a spiritual allegory. Each term represents a potential inner obstacle for a seeker. The drum. That symbolizes the ear, always hearing the external noise, the worldly chatter, but deaf to the subtle inner divine sound.
Okay, the ear is a drum. Makes sense.
A fool represents the intellect when it's ignorant of spiritual truths. Untrained, basically.
Right.
A person of a low caste. This symbolizes the eyes. Why? Because the eyes can tempt us with worldly desires, pulling us down.
Interesting connection, the eyes.
The animal stands for the breath. Like a wild animal, our breath is often uncontrolled, forceful, exhaling wildly, when in spiritual practice it needs to be regulated, made subtle.
Okay, the breath as an animal.
And finally, the woman here symbolizes the tongue.
The tongue, why?
Because, like a tongue that wags constantly, uncontrolled speech, gossip, criticism, negativity leads to distraction and spiritual downfall.
Wow. Okay, that completely transforms the meaning from something offensive to a profound teaching about controlling the senses and the mind.
Exactly. It's all internal allegory.
And you can see how, as the source notes, people who didn't get that implied meaning might understandably be quite upset.
Absolutely. It shows the danger of literalism. Another quick example, the word Shrimat, worldly meaning. Rich person, millionaire, right?
Yeah, wealthy.
Spiritually, it means someone who possesses Shri, which is divine energy, beauty, virtue. Totally different quality. The meaning just shifts depending on the context.
These shifts aren't just quirks of language, are they? They point to something deeper, maybe structural challenges in the texts themselves. Our source has a neat way of showing this contrast.
Yes, comparing the worldly versus the spiritual understanding of common terms. It really drives the point home.
Let's run through a couple. What about ignorance?
Okay, worldly ignorance. That's just not knowing stuff about the world, lacking information.
Simple enough? Spiritual ignorance.
That's the big one. It's the fundamental mistake of believing I am this body or I am this mind, instead of realizing your true nature as something deeper, as spirit or consciousness.
So mistaken identity, basically.
Exactly. What about knowing oneself?
Worldly, I guess that's knowing your personality, your strengths, weaknesses, psychological stuff.
Right. Self-awareness in a psychological sense.
Right.
But spiritually.
Right.
It's the ultimate realization. I am Brahman. Identifying completely with the divine principle, not the limited self.
Huge difference. And success.
Worldly success, we know that one. Getting respect, money, status, power.
The usual benchmarks.
Spiritual success. Much simpler, but harder. It's just making genuine spiritual progress on your path. That's it.
Doesn't matter about the external stuff.
Not in the ultimate sense. And one more. The phrase A cheats B.
Okay, worldly meaning is obvious. B got cheated, B is the victim.
Right, but spiritually, the implication is that A, the cheater, is actually the one who's truly cheated. Because A accrues negative karma, creates obstacles for their own spiritual growth, misses a chance to act rightly. A loses out in the bigger picture.
That's a complete turnaround. It really forces you to rethink cause and effect, doesn't it?
It does. It's a total reorientation.
Yeah.
And beyond these language traps, there are other hurdles, more like hidden structures or assumptions in these ancient texts.
Like how incredibly condensed they often are. You mentioned Patanjali's Yoga Shastra, the entire science of yoga in just 195 short verses, these sutras.
Exactly. Traditionally, you needed a guru to unpack those. They weren't meant as standalone DIY manuals.
Which leads to other issues today, right? Since that guru-disciple tradition isn't as widespread.
Precisely. Many texts have an absence of worldly suggestions. Patanjali talks about ethics, yam, like nonviolence, truthfulness, contentment, crucial stuff.
Right.
But he doesn't give you a detailed how-to guide for applying them in your messy modern daily life. That practical wisdom was usually transmitted orally by the guru. You also find an absence of explanation. In many places, concepts are just stated, not elaborated upon. And often an absence of comparative studies, they don't typically compare path A with path B. You, the seeker, have to figure out how they relate. Connect the dots yourself.
So it requires a lot more active participation and interpretation from the seeker. It's not passive reading.
Not at all. And these internal challenges get magnified when different cultural viewpoints come into play, like the contrast between Western psychology and Indian psychology, which is essentially the science of spirituality.
Right. Western psychology often focuses on the mind, the intellect, personality development. You mentioned that Santayana quote, "There is no cure for birth and death, save to enjoy the interval." Kind of sums up a focus on making this life better through understanding the mind.
It does lean that way. It perceives things primarily through the mind and intellect, but the science of spirituality says, hold on, the real perceiver is the soul, which is beyond the mind and intellect.
A deeper layer.
A much deeper layer, which Western psychology hasn't really systematically explored yet, according to our source. And think about goals. Western approaches often aim to develop or strengthen the personality, build a strong ego, in a sense.
Self-esteem, confidence, etc.
Exactly. Whereas spiritual practice, through things like meditation, often aims to transcend the personality, to go beyond that individual ego. Not to destroy the self, but to liberate it from its limitations, to merge with something larger.
Different aims entirely.
Yeah.
Okay, but what about people listening who just think, none of this resonates, I don't believe in souls or God or any of it? Let's talk about atheism.
Sure. It's interesting, the source notes that statistically, only about 5% of the world's population identifies as atheist. That number has apparently been pretty stable for a very long time.
Only 5%? That's surprisingly low.
It is. And often, the source suggests, atheists might feel, spirituality isn't for me, based on a misunderstanding of what it actually involves. Many assume it's only about believing in God.
Which isn't always the case.
Not at all. There are a couple of key misconceptions. First, maybe 90% of people practicing spirituality follow a path of devotion, Bhakti, focusing on a personal deity.
Okay, lots of focus on God there.
Right, so an atheist might see that and think, well, I don't believe in God, so I can't do this. But they often don't realize other paths exist.
Such as?
Like the Sankhya philosophy. It offers a complete path of final liberation, moksha, without needing God at the center. And Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, we mentioned 195 verses. Only 7 even mention God.
Only 7 out of 195.
While the other 188, no mention of God at all. So an atheist could absolutely practice yoga philosophy and make huge spiritual progress without compromising their lack of belief in a deity.
That's a really important point. What's the second misconception?
It's about misunderstanding the goal, final liberation, or spiritual progress. At its core, it means achieving bliss, anand. This isn't just happiness. It's a state of deep inner contentment that goes beyond both happiness and unhappiness.
A state beyond opposites.
Exactly. Experiencing that continually is final liberation. And the source asks, once you understand that's the goal, which atheists would say, no thanks, I don't want that kind of profound inner peace.
Good question. Probably none.
And there's a curious observation in the source, too, about who tends to be atheist. It suggests high-salaried individuals are more often atheist, maybe because financial security reduces the perceived need for divine help.
Whereas business owners,
who face constant uncertainty, ups and downs, tend to be less atheist. They might feel a greater need for support beyond themselves. It's an interesting correlation, suggesting a link between worldly security and spiritual openness.
Fascinating. And the source adds a bit of historical context, the traditional definition of an atheist.
Yes, traditionally it was those criticizing the Vedas, which is kind of funny, the source notes, because most modern atheists probably haven't actually read the Vedas they might implicitly critique.
A bit ironic.
And the Upanishads pose a challenge, asking non-believers, if there's no higher principle, what really compels righteous behavior? They say the sun, moon, earth all revolve, fearing the Lord, implying a cosmic order that keeps things in check, something beyond just human rules.
A question about ultimate accountability. Okay, so we've covered language, structure, culture, atheism. What about those of us who pride ourselves on logic? This brings us to meaningless rationalism. How does that get in the way?
This is a big one. The source really pushes back against the idea that the intellect is the ultimate measure of all things. It argues, quite simply, that the intellect has limits.
How so?
Well, you can't measure everything with the same tool, right? Your mind perceives emotions, your tongue perceives taste. You wouldn't try to measure acidity with a weighing scale. It's the wrong instrument.
Right, wrong tool for the job.
Exactly. So the source says, trying to grasp or validate spiritual experience, which is born of experience, purely through the intellect, is a similar category error. The premise, only what my intellect understands is true, is flawed when dealing with realms beyond intellectual grasp.
So spiritual experiences are just different.
They operate on a different level. The Upanishads weren't written to rationally convince intellectuals. They were guidance for jinyasu, curious seekers aiming for direct experience.
And when that's missed, you get misunderstandings.
You get some really quite funny, though perhaps frustrating, examples. The source mentions a women's liberation group asking why female deities aren't excluded from worship during menstruation, like human women sometimes are.
Okay.
The question itself shows a lack of understanding, the source argues. Deities, being non-physical, don't have physical bodies or functions like menstruation. It does note an exception for the Kamakshi temple, where the idol is treated as humanified. It's applying a purely physical, rational lens to something non-physical.
Applying worldly logic where it doesn't fit.
Precisely. And this highlights a key attitudinal shift. If you approach something new with, I do not agree with it, well, the conversation stops there. You've closed the door.
But if you approach it with,
I do not understand it.
Sure.
That opens the door. It invites explanation, learning, dialogue. That shift from disagreement to acknowledging lack of understanding is crucial, especially for rationalists exploring spirituality.
That's a really useful distinction. Our source actually contrasts rationalists and seekers directly, doesn't it?
Yes, it lays it out quite clearly. Rationalists, motivation to realize God, generally absent. Spiritual practice, absent. Proof needed. Actual, tangible proof. Ego level, often high. Seekers, both the curious jidyasu and the liberation-focused mumukshu. Motivation, present. Practice, present. Proof. Often, the scriptural word or the experience itself is the proof. Ego tends to be lower, or at least they're working on reducing it.
That's quite a stark contrast. The source even suggests factors behind a rationalist viewpoint.
It does. Intriguingly, it attributes it 60% to destiny, 20% to guidance by subtle, distressing energies, and 20% to vital energy factors. It's a spiritual perspective on why someone might lean heavily rationalist.
And it issues a kind of challenge to rationalists.
Yes, basically saying, Before you speak definitively about spirituality, why not try practicing it sincerely yourself for a few years? Experience it firsthand, because there's a difference between intellectual information describing a piece of chalk, its color, weight, limited by time and place, and spiritual knowledge.
Which
comes through subtle perception, potentially seeing that chalk's past, its future, who made it, where it will end up. It transcends the purely physical and temporal. It reminds me of what Sri Shankaracharya said, "The web of words is a great forest that causes the mind to wander." Mere intellectual knowledge, just knowing the words, isn't enough for true spiritual understanding. You need the experience.
Experience over information. Got it. The source also briefly mentions social commitments, right?
Yeah.
How does spirituality view those?
It acknowledges them. There are traditionally 4 debts to God, to the sages, to ancestors, and to society. But it views these from a spiritual angle, not purely through modern psychological ideas of equality or social justice. And crucially, it tends to prioritize commitment to the eternal truth, or the guru representing that truth, over social commitments which are seen as constantly changing and less permanent.
A different hierarchy of values. Okay, one last perspective to touch on. Charvak philosophy. This sounds quite different.
Very different. The name Charvak itself means melodious speech. Charvak. Perhaps because its message is quite appealing to many.
What's the core message?
It's pretty straightforward materialism. So long as one lives, one should live happily. How? By feasting on clarified butter? Even by incurring debt.
Live it up now, even if you have to borrow.
Essentially. Because the philosophy argues, once this body is reduced to ashes, the same will not be acquired again. It's focused entirely on enjoying this material existence to the fullest. YOLO, ancient Indian style.
Huh. You only live once, indeed. That's certainly a simpler message than merging with Brahman.
Much simpler. And the source notes, while many people might like hearing that kind of advice, enjoy yourself, don't worry about later. Far fewer seem naturally inclined towards the spiritual path's call, which often involves service, sacrifice, and looking beyond immediate gratification.
Wow. Okay. What an exploration we've had today. We've really journeyed through the maze of spiritual language, haven't we? Unpacking those implied meanings, looking at the hurdles of rationalism, atheism, different philosophies, all drawn from this fantastic source material.
It really shows that if we connect this to the bigger picture, well, the core takeaway seems to be that true understanding, especially in spirituality, often means we have to look past the surface. We need to be open to different ways of seeing things, and maybe, just maybe, acknowledge that our intellect, powerful as it is, might not be the only tool in the box or even the right one for everything.
Yeah, it's about consciously adjusting our focus, being willing to explore those hidden layers. So what does this mean for you listening right now? It means maybe realizing that some really profound wisdom could be hiding right there in plain sight. It might just be waiting for you to shift your perspective slightly to ask what's really being said here beyond just the literal words.
And perhaps this raises a final thought to chew on. If even these ancient texts, which can seem so clear on the surface, actually hold such deep, complex, multi-layered meanings, well, what other parts of your life, what other interactions or beliefs might benefit from a similar deep dive? Looking for the implied understanding, not just settling for the literal surface. Something to think about, maybe.